Hi everybody, welcome to the last content part on startup psychology, the environment. We talk about persuasion today, and right now I want to cover a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about the underlying theory of persuasion. So let's jump right into it. So first of all, there's like four very common strategies. Those of you that like frequented the readings or are familiar with Cialdini, they're like well explained in the literature. The first one would be, for instance, and sorry for the camera covering it up, but I will put the slides online, all of the slides, I'll do it today, big promise. First technique would be the foot in the door technique. So this is this idea that you would start with a very, very small request initially, right? And you would get people into the habit of agreeing to a small request, because who wouldn't? It's just a small request. And then slowly build up on it. So let's say you are 12 years old and you want to go to the movies, and you ask your mom, like, hey, can me and my friend go to the movies? Your mom's like, yeah, okay, why not? You know, good for me. I can chill at home and I don't have to take care of the kids. They're out of the house, good job. So the mom would agree. And then it's like, hey, could you maybe drive us? And then mom's like, oh, okay, why not? You know, since they're going to the movies, I might already drive them. And then they're like, hey, do you also have like, 10 euros to pay for the movie tickets? And so on. So this is the logic. And it goes back to a study by Friedman and Fraser, like it's also in the 60s. Most of those psychological research is late 50s, 60s, 70s, sometimes even 80s. So they're all really old. And by now they're like, more complicated and built up, but the principle stays the same, right? And what they did is they just called housewives. So back then, worse times, bad times. Women were staying at home, more likely to stay at home. And were, taking care of the household, and just called them and say, hey, can we have a look at your kitchen utensils? We want to see what you're using. And most people would be like, yeah, of course I'm using, 18 dishes and I'm using this ladle and this pen, whatever. So they would get in the habit of agreeing to, those kind of requests. And then a few weeks later, they would call again. It's like, with like 6 people, they would stand at her door, actually, not call. Can we archive that? Can we go through your kitchen? And the people that already agreed, the principle, the underlying principle would be commitment and consistency. They were more likely to go along and let 6 random strangers into a house to archive the kitchen utensils. And of course it wasn't about the kitchen, it was more about, do people actually agree in letting us in? So this is the first principle, like start small, build up from it. So to speak, the opposite principle, that would be the door in the face technique. And the door in the face technique is more or less this idea that you start with an extreme request. Can I, burn down the house? No, you can't. Well, can I then have a cookie? Yeah, you can have a cookie, because it's relatively speaking not a minor thing to ask of. And the idea here is reciprocity, because by starting with an extreme request, right, people say no, people deny your request, and that makes people feel bad in a sense. So they feel like you're being so nice, and here I am denying you your request, so I want to give back to you, reciprocity, right? I want to do something good in return, so I want to make a concession, so to speak, and therefore they're then more likely to agree to the second request. So an example for that is like actually a really, really cool study by Cialdini himself from the mid 80s, or so, 75. And what they did is they just went into random shopping malls. That's how psychology worked back then. And they asked random strangers, it's like, hey, can you spend 2 hours every week for up to 3 years to take care of juvenile delinquents? So like people that broke the law but are not old enough to go to prison, but they shall be rehabilitated still. Can you spend time with them? Can you take time out of your busy work life a day and go to them and like teach them, how to behave? And 3 years, is quite a long time. So most people like, of course not. Like, hell no, why would I do that? And they're like, you know what? Okay, that's understandable. Maybe this weekend, could you take 3 hours to go to the zoo with them? And then people are like, I didn't do the 3-year thing. I didn't want to be, I don't want to sound like an asshole. So I'm actually agreeing to take those kids to the zoo. But what it actually means is that out of nowhere, you got a stranger to take people to the zoo, which was your initial target, right? Keep that in mind. That's why it's persuasion. So you get people to do something that they would probably not do without all the setup that you used before. So start large, and large is not the target, and then dial down quite a notch, and that is actually the target. So those are like the most common, and you've all heard them, and you've all experienced them. Another strategy that I hope you haven't experienced, but most of you will, is called lowballing. And lowballing, artificially said, is this idea that you get people to agree to do something. You agree on certain terms, and then afterwards, after the agreement was made, you change the terms of that agreement. So a classic example would be you want to buy a car, right? And you go to your, that's actually where this technique comes from, no joke. Or where it was first observed and quantified in science. So you want to buy a car, and you go to the car salesman and you say, "Hey, I want to, test ride this car. Looks really nice. Can we drive around?" So you take the car out, drive around, and you like start liking the car. It feels like your car or whatever, and you agree on a price. So $20,000 is your car. Hell yeah, let's do it. And then you walk into the office, and the salesman's like, "Yeah, you know what? I talked with the manager. Actually, 20,000 is not the price I can offer you. It's only 25,000." However, you want to be committed and consistent with what you agreed with yourself. Actually, it's like you really like the car, you drove around it, feels like it's yours. So you actually end up, regrettingly, so to speak, buy the car nonetheless for 25 as compared to 20,000 bucks. And it leaves you like a little bit sore, and that's lowballing. The problem with lowballing is that it's also called buyer's remorse, right? It's like you might actually, if you use the technique, well, I recommend against it, right? But if you use it, use it in one-shot interactions where you're very sure that you're not going to interact with this person again, because as I said, it will leave like a sour taste, and people don't like being lowballed. It's not a very ethical strategy. And the last one, also very simple, actually comes also from the US. Most of the studies, most of the psychological schools are predominant in the United States. They looked at Girl Scouts, actually. And what they do is they go from door to door and they sell cookies. And what they initially did is they sold 2 cupcakes and a cookie, I think it was, yeah. 2 cupcakes and a cookie for 75 cents. And then I saw how many people buy them. People are generally nice and like buying them, so 60% of people bought those cupcakes, something like that. And what they then is can we pump those numbers up? Those numbers are rookie numbers. Maybe we can get it to 80% or 90%. And they actually managed to do so. And what they did, they split their package offering. So they said, "Do you want to buy 2 cookies for 75 cents?" And before the other party could answer, 2 cupcakes for 75 cents, excuse me. And before the other party could answer, they were like, "And here's a cookie on top of it," right? So this additional extra, so the cookie, it feels like the cookie is free, although initially they were selling it as a combi package, right? It feels like the cookie is free, which brings us back to this idea of reciprocity, right? And then people feel obliged, they're nice to me, so I'm going to be nice to them back. And being nice to them back means buying the package, right? So they buy the 2 cupcakes and they get a cookie on top. So the bundling, so to speak, makes the sell here because it evokes reciprocity. So those are the principles. And now I want to talk about, let's say, 3 core underlying mechanisms of how attitude, like how people are persuaded, right? It's like the change of attitude or behavior or intention or whatever. We talked about it in the last slide, in the last course, or in the last video. I want to talk about the mechanisms behind it. And the idea for me, as one of the motivations for me to do this video, I speak rather quickly in general, but for those of you that only look marginally interested, in YouTube you can, click on the little wheel on the bottom and just select the higher speed and just listen to it. Maybe you catch onto something subconsciously, just offering it. Not judging if you don't pay too close attention, but those of you who are interested, I'm going to talk through 3 core principles of how attitudes can be changed. The first one you've all heard is called cognitive dissonance. So Viktor Frankl puts it like, if we are no longer able to change the situation, we have to change ourselves. And where this comes from is also often it's like you want to be internally consistent, right? It's what 2 of those 3 mechanisms rely on consistency theory, actually. You want to be internally consistent. If you say you want to do something, you actually want to do it, because otherwise, people might start mistrusting you. However, this is internal. It's just in you. And people are sometimes in a situation where they're holding contradictory beliefs. And those contradictory beliefs cause them stress. This is called, the stress is labeled cognitive dissonance, so to speak. And then what happens, because you don't like being in stress, right? You have an adaptive reaction where you just change your attitude to be internally consistent. So let me give you an example. So for instance, artificially speaking, let's say you're all good students, and you really are. You pre-selected people, you're smart, you're not the average, Dutch citizen or wherever you may be from, internationals, right? Because you study and you have studied and you've graduated before, those kind of things. But still, you think you're really smart, right? And then you end up getting very bad grades at university. But you're also working hard, for instance. And then the question is like, I have this belief on the one hand that I'm really smart, and on the other hand, I get really, really bad grades. So I have cognitively speaking, there's bad grades. Emotionally speaking, I think I'm smart. So there's a conflict. And how can you evolve this conflict? You could say, well, teachers are shit, or grades are not important, and you have an easy way out of this, right? And then you can still hold this belief that you're smart, just like everyone is against you. Or you can say, maybe, I'm not as smart as I thought I am. So, for instance, I used cognitive dissonance in my master's thesis for psychology graduation, and what we did is we put people in MRI scanners, and generally this idea is that when you get your brain scanned, you can't move, you have to rely absolutely still, especially if you do experiments that last up to like an hour or two even, and you're in this claustrophobic little pipe, and there's like a humming sound around you, and it's for most people it's not a nice experience. And then in the second step, it's like you would ask the people that went through that experience to go to the waiting room where the other participants were and tell them that it was really nice and get them motivated to also participate. And there were two conditions. So the first time we instructed participants to just tell the other people that it's a great experience, to like flat out lie, right? And the second time we paid them $20. And the funny thing is then we scanned actually the people that told the lie, so to speak, again. And we saw that the people that were not paid, actually there's an area in the brain, it's a DACC, the dorsal-anterior cortical cortex, I think, don't quote me on that, was activated, which is it's an area that's correlated with attitude change. And what happened for them, basically, long story short here, is that because they couldn't justify their lie with being paid, it's like they lied for free, so to speak, they changed their perception of being in that scanner. So they actually ended up liking the scanner more to stay consistent with the lie they just told, right? So for them, it wasn't a lie anymore because they started liking the scanner because they were instructed to say only good things about it. So that's the idea of cognitive dissonance in a nutshell. I'm sure there's YouTube videos out there that are more, offer a better representation or explanation. Just if you're curious, look it up. It's a very common theory actually. The next one, even more simple than cognitive dissonance, it's also related to consistency theories, as I said before, is this idea of balance. So people internally want to hold consistent beliefs, right? And Haider I think he was a sociologist. He wrote a paper on this in 1958, although I quote him here as 1946. That's the first time this theory occurred. He says that people can be either in states of balance or unbalance. So unbalance, for instance, would be this example here. It's like, say, I really, really like eating steak, so I'm not a vegan. It's an artificial example, obviously. Nothing against vegans. I really like steak, but I also really like Ellen DeGeneres. But, and that's why I use the dotted line here, I learned that Ellen DeGeneres doesn't like steak. She is a proclaimed vegan. She's against meat eaters. Again, hypothetical example, although I think she is a vegan. So what I can do now is I have two options, right? It's like I can either start disliking steak, right, to be consistent with my love to Ellen DeGeneres, or I could say, screw Ellen DeGeneres, I'm going to continue eating steak. And this is usually what happens, right? And this is also this idea where the statement of like a friend of a friend is a friend comes from, right? Just like you can play it, or an enemy of an enemy is and so on. Like if I don't like steak and Ellen DeGeneres doesn't like steak, I might like Ellen DeGeneres. So this is this idea. So people prefer consistent, relationships, and they tend to over time, not right in the moment, right? They tend to over time move away from inconsistencies. It's pretty straightforward, not rocket science. The last one, however, is I think is quite intriguing. It's quite interesting, and it's quite impactful in your social lives and in your daily lives. For those of you that did the reading on the second paper, they are using the elaboration likelihood model by Petty and Cacioppo from '86. You don't need to pay too close attention here. For those of you that didn't, a quick recap. This idea is that you have two pathways of how you can be influenced. One is a very superficial pathway. It's very quick. It relates to this type 1 thinking that we covered in one of the videos in the first part of the module. And it's only on the surface. And the other one is a deeper route of persuasion, right? The central pathway. So we have a peripheral and a central pathway. And the central pathway is you really use type 2 thinking. So you really engage your cognition and you really think about the quality of the arguments, right? And if something is really dear to you, let's say you want to make an important consumer choice, you want to buy a new laptop, you want to buy a new computer, things that you don't buy on an everyday basis, that you care about deeply, right? You invest the mental resources into making that choice. So you make an elaborate choice, so to speak, right? And here it's important if you want to convince people, persuade people, from a marketing perspective, for instance, that you use a few very good arguments, right? That's how you get people. That's how you get people to do what you want them to do. However, if you're selling something, for instance, that, that's an all-day product for, I don't know, you want to buy toothpaste, you're way more likely to rely on those mental shortcuts. So this is how this is connected, right? So this peripheral pathway, when your motivation is low, to think about the message, right? It's very superficial. This is the idea. This is the pathway where you are very prone to fall prey to this cognitive biases and heuristics. So this is also the reason why, for instance, supermarkets, they rent out shelf space. This is part of their business model. It's not just that they sell products. They typically also rent out shelf space. And for instance, a shelf that's on the height of your arms, or on the height of your eyes, actually, where the product appears, the most prominent, where it's the easiest reachable for most people, is more expensive than a bottom shelf. That's why you have cheaper products typically on the bottom, right? Because those shelves are also cheaper. I'm not sure if that's true in the Netherlands, but in the United States it applies quite well. And here for all day products, we don't care. You rely on cues. Is it good looking? Are there more arguments in favor of buying it, or is it more easily reachable? Things that from a rational standpoint do not make any sense or say anything about the quality of the product, right? So keep that in mind. Two pathways: central, type 2 thinking. You really think about it. You use cognition. Quality arguments are important. And peripheral, you just count the number of arguments. You're more easily convinced, and also you don't develop an identification with the product that strongly. So you're more easily diverted from that product later on, right? You don't form a bond. So this is the whole idea. I'm just thinking really quick if I forgot anything there. And I think you've covered it. So those are the three principles that underlie. And as I said before, I want to briefly also talk about the flip side of persuasion, right? It's how do we defend ourselves against it? Because this quote is not really relevant. Because they say it's not hard to actually change attitudes, which is true for the central route processing, but for the superficial processing we're actually quite easily influenced. But how do we defend ourselves against influence, right? Because we have to keep in mind that persuasion is something most people encounter several hundred times on a daily basis. And I'm mostly talking about TV commercials, people in the streets, wanting something to you, your teacher hoping you do a good job on the final assignments and engaging you there, or yada yada yada. Your girlfriend wanting you to, although she might use power actually, to clean the dishes, whatever you name it. Persuasion is an all-day thing, and there are numbers between 100 and 1,000 that we encounter daily attempts of it. But how can we be more aware and more cautious and more careful when it comes to persuasion? Because we could also be cynical, right? Especially when it comes to consumer products. It doesn't really matter if you buy a Coke or a Fanta, because they're actually both part of the Coca-Cola brand. That's just just a little side anecdote here. How can we? What's the science underlying persuasion? How do people what strategies do people use to defend themselves against persuasion? And more importantly, it's behind my face. Why do people do that? Let's start with the how, right? So the first of all is people contest persuasion. So I'm just going to stop you really quick because I lost my train of thought. Hold on. Yeah, and I'm back. So people contest persuasion by disentangling or lining out the elements of persuasion, so the source, for instance, or the message, right? And then actively attacking those elements. So for instance, if a person you don't like tries to persuade you, this person has a very, very, very limited chance of actually getting you to do what he or she wants you to do, just because you can engage her on a personal level. It's this person is an idiot or an asshole, I don't want to be persuaded, end of story. Empowerment is this idea that you have your beliefs, right? And the persuasion attempt means changing that beliefs or attitudes. And you just go out of your way to empower your attitudes that you already have, to hold your belief that you already have. So you could ask let's say, you could ask your mom to reinforce, and tell you what you want to hear. You could ask your friend to tell you what you want to hear, that your attitudes are correct, that you don't need to change, that the other parties are at fault here. And people, of course, use bias processing. So this is this idea that, for instance, an application of the negative halo effect. For those of you that are interested, we talked about the halo effect really a little bit in one of the first slides or lectures. This idea that, let's say you're a big fan. Let me use an example. You're a big fan of an iPhone, right? It's a cool product. You really like it, and then you come across a study that says that, let's say the reception is really bad. So the cell service is like, it's not a good chip that they built in there. It doesn't really work properly. Whatever. And most people that are not big fans of iPhones, what they would do is like this one, feature of the iPhone that seems to be bad would spill over into other features. So you would start liking the overall product not too much. However, if you're a fan, then you don't really care. And even if the cell reception was important to you, what might happen is you shift what's important to you, right? So you say, okay, who cares about the cell service? I get, this amount of data, or my phone is that fast, or it looks that cool. So you start paying relatively more attention to other features of the product. So there's an example. There was a study on voters of Bill Clinton when the Monica Lewinsky affair was so prominent in the news. It's like, before that, what they valued in Democratic leaders like Bill Clinton tended to be like honesty, right? And afterwards, they were paying attention to, so they walked away. It's like, it's not important that the leader is honest. Now it's more important that the leaders, it's a strong leader, or they paid attention to other features of Bill Clinton. So they didn't really care about his, inhonesty in that affair. Or altogether, easiest strategy and the easiest to explain, I should have started with that actually, avoidance. Simply put, is like you can avoid persuasion, by just taking the remote and zipping somewhere else when the commercial pops up, or muting the TV and like talk with your partner or do something else, right? Just avoid persuasion altogether. So that brings me to the question: why do people defend against persuasion? And there's generally like three concerns. The first of all is like, it's freedom to like the threat to your personal freedom. It's like, if you want me to buy that product, it's like you try to influence me to do something that you want. I'm not okay with that because I want to do my own choices, right? So this is people, like, you could apply it to Corona even, right? When people and doctors tell you to stay at home, not only save yourself, but more importantly, save others. They're like, yes, but it's my personal freedom to go out. It's my choice. F you, I'm going out, right? That's this idea of like the threat to freedom. And so people are like rebels and they want to lash out. And that's an innate, threat. The other one is concerns of deception. So, of course, and this is a big one because it also relates to our class right now. The more you learn about persuasion and how it works, the better you actually become at defending yourself against it. So this is this idea of persuasion knowledge. So, for instance, those of you that took one of those students' job, I had one when I was younger, and it was a horrible experience actually. Where you stand around in shopping malls and you just gather signatures, or you are actually trying to sell, like, let's say, newspapers and get people to get on board with a newspaper subscription for the Parool or one of the other Dutch papers, right? Or you want to collect money for any cause, and basically the more people know, the less likely they are to be persuaded by you if you want to do this, right? And this is why if you get training in how to persuade people, they will train you to engage people that are young, usually below 25, because before 25, people haven't fully developed their personality and who they are yet. They're still more susceptible to change and thus more susceptible to being persuaded, right? Or very old, because very old people, they like social interactions, they might be lonely, and they're also really kind and, more easily, tricked into, maybe giving, those kind of things, which is very unethical in my opinion, right? But the more you know, after 25, and like you've learned a little bit about persuasion, the harder it is to actually persuade you. And obviously the last why, which is, we talked about that as well, it's called the status quo, right, effect, or the default bias. The status quo is so incredibly powerful. I think a lot of people don't understand and don't realize that. It's like, in general, people are reluctant to change. It's like, my status quo is okay, I have everything I need. Why would I suddenly get a product I've never heard of? This is what makes startups such a risky endeavor, right? It's like the status quo of people, I'm repeating myself by emphasizing this, right? But the status quo of people is like, I don't need to buy this. And you have to persuade them to buy this. So you have to try to overcome this reluctance to change, which is the last real reason behind why people defend against persuasion. Okay, just gonna click here. What can you take home from that? Well, how do you defend yourself against persuasion in a nutshell, right? I said that before and I'm emphasizing it again, and this is how I a little bit started my content slides, right? Like behavior being a function of who we are, which is partly our control, right? And then also the environment that we are in, which is 100% our control, or like, let's say to a large extent our control. Control your freaking environment. It's like, my girlfriend is like next room, right? And she bought fucking chips, she brought them home, and I never eat junk food, but I know I'm gonna eat them because they're in my house. This is this idea like, do not go grocery shopping if you're hungry, right? Do not negotiate if you really need to buy a product. It's like if your car breaks down and you need to buy a product and you go to a car dealer and you tell them that, you're in a very, very tough spot, right? Do not negotiate under time pressure. Try to control your environments. That's the bottom line, right? And of course, if you know you're going to engage in a persuasion, for instance, at the car dealer, or, you know, if I have to pay you a paper because it was really bad or you didn't really prepare, and you make an appointment with me and you want to talk about it, which I'm always happy to do, right? Although I'm confident that you all are motivated and can do great papers. Shout out to you. Prepare, right? Think about what are your arguments. Maybe even create a scoring system with your arguments, right? Those kind of things. And if you wanna buy a car, you know, like separate what's influence. Where does this person who wants to sell the car just want to influence me? What's the rational argument? Those kind of things. And in big decision making, really important. We talked about that too as well. Try to point either actively look for information that confirm what you already believe, or disconfirm what you already believe, more so, or appoint someone to do that, like a devil's advocate, right? So keep that in mind. With that, I think we reached the end of content. Yes, I just have to show this in terms of, you know, property rights whatsoever. Also for the images and more images. And I think with that, yes, we've reached the end of persuasion. It was my big pleasure. I hope I'm understandable. I hope you, at least, you know, every once in a while caught onto something that has sparked your interest. And if not, then still thank you for paying attention. I'm going to see you in class soon, and I'm also going to prepare a little video on the assignments just to, you know, remedy any questions that might come up. If there are questions, you find my email somewhere on Canvas, just shoot me an email, don't hesitate, right? It was my pleasure, and I wish you all the best from here, and good luck on the assignments, and thanks for tuning in.